The Bible commands us in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15 to be able to give a reasonable defense of our faith. This episode will explain how saltwater fish, freshwater fish, and plants would have survived the Genesis flood. The simple answer is that saltwater has a higher salinity content than freshwater. According to the National Ocean and Atmospheric Administration, the concentration of salt in seawater, the salinity, is about 35 parts per thousand on average. Stated another way, about 3.5% of the weight of seawater comes from the dissolved salts. During the Genesis flood, due to the fact that the entire earth was deluged with water, both salt and fresh water would have mixed. When we look into the world today, we observe that there are many fish species that are specialized to either fresh or salt water. To be specialized is to be adapted to a certain type of environment. Now, we know that only animals, including birds, that were land-dwelling and air-breathing were on board the ark. Thus, due to the fact that we find fish specializing today, many inquire how the Genesis flood would have affected marine life. There is no way to answer this question exactly, as the salinity content of the seas prior to the Genesis flood is unknown. However, we can come to the understanding that the salinity content would have been raised after the Genesis flood. The Genesis flood broke up the fountains of the great deep. The breaking up of the fountains of the great deep would have triggered earth movements, which in turn would initiate volcanic activity. Underwater volcanic activity would dissolve minerals, which in turn would increase the salinity of the sea. For more information on the fountains of the great deep and catastrophic plate tectonics, please see the episode of Genesis Under a Microscope on catastrophic plate tectonics. It is possible for many marine organisms to survive salinity changes, especially those that are estuarine or tidal species. For example, starfish have the ability to survive as low as approximately 16% to 18% of the normal concentration of salt in seawater, and barnacles have the ability to survive approximately a tenth of the usual salt concentration of seawater. There are numerous species of fish that migrate between both fresh and salt water, such as salmon, striped bass, and Atlantic sturgeon. These fish all spawn in freshwater and then mature in saltwater. Interestingly, eels have the ability to reproduce in saltwater and then mature in freshwater. Furthermore, many of the families of fish that can hybridize have both salt and freshwater species. A few examples would be the bowfin, the herring, the salmon, the catfish, etc. The fact that many fish have both fresh and saltwater species is indicative of the fact that prior to the specialization that occurred after the flood, most fish had the genetic diversity and vitality to withstand large changes in salinity. This ability has since deteriorated due to genetic entropy. Not all fish were specialized prior to the Genesis flood. It was after the Genesis flood that selective pressure caused deletion or rearranging of the information or genome in the fish species, causing them to be specialized. For example, there is a fish called a sturgeon. One sturgeon is called the Atlantic sturgeon, and as a migratory fish, it can cope with both salt and fresh water. There is another type of sturgeon called the Siberian sturgeon that is specialized for freshwater. Numerous examples of fish families have both fresh and saltwater species. A few notable examples would be the salmon, the trout, the pike, the toadfish, the garpike, the flatfish, the sturgeon, and the herring. Many more examples could be given, and the fact that most of the fish families today have fresh and saltwater species indicates that the fish at the time of the flood would have possessed the vitality to tolerate salinity changes. Specialization via natural selection caused fish to gradually lose the ability to tolerate these salinity changes. The urine of freshwater species has a low salt concentration, and thus the kidneys emit excess water. The urine of saltwater species has a higher salt concentration, and thus the kidneys excrete excess salt. Fish, like the sawfish or the carpenter shark, can compensate for this difference. The sawfish increase their urine output, and their blood uric concentration decreases when they go from a saltwater environment to a freshwater environment. There are many fish species that are observed today being able to withstand salinity changes and can adapt to either fresh or salt water in their own lifespan. Being that such organisms like whales do not depend on clean water for oxygen, the salinity change would not have affected them being able to obtain oxygen. Due to turbidity and temperature changes in the Genesis floodwaters, many marine creatures went extinct during the Genesis flood. In fact, the fossil record is composed of 95% of marine life, which is exactly what one would expect from the biblical account of the fountains of the great deep breaking open. Evolutionary explanations of the marine fossil record do not make sense, as they claim that the fossil record is a record of transitional fossils. Yet, there are dozens of living fossils like clams, starfish, horseshoe crabs, coelacanths, sturgeons, etc. that have lasted for millions of years and have remained essentially unchanged, defying the evolutionary timeline. While there are marine creatures that survived the Genesis flood, there were those that did not survive and went extinct, like trilobites. Fresh water can sit on top of salt water for some lengths of time because its density is not as great as that of salt water. At higher latitudes, turbulence would have been lower, and thus layers of fresh and salt water would have endured, providing both fresh and salt water in these localities. There are a few different ways that plants could have survived the flood. For one, terrestrial seeds have been observed to survive soaking in salt water. Now, while seed germination would have been impeded to some extent by the salt water, This would actually serve in the plant's benefit, as it would have prevented plants from germinating in the water and dying prior to being able to take root somewhere. Plants also survived in floating vegetation masses, or on pumice from volcanic activity. There were also plants and seeds that were taken on board the ark, and some seeds that have hooks could have attached themselves to animals on the ark. Other methods of plant survival include fragmentation, which is the ability of certain plants to asexually sprout. Other seeds could have survived in the floating carcasses of dead herbivores. At the tail end of his time on the ark, Noah sent out a dove to scout for land. This dove returned with life. The dove gave Noah an olive leaf, showing that plants were already regenerating. I pray that you enjoyed this episode of Genesis Under a Microscope, and that you will subscribe to Christ Jesus Ministries YouTube channel. For more faith-building content, continue to watch the rest of the episodes in this series. Please see the description, where you will also find a study guide on this video's topic. Take note of the fact that Christians shouldn't be salty, and remember, the truth saves.